Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson. Tonight, a lot going on as always. A new investigation of Google uncovers how employees of the sinister tech monopoly once again discuss ways to censor your political views without your knowledge. Nobody in Congress seems to think this is a problem. These new details might change their minds, fingers crossed. Plus, yesterday we told you how Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer has made the banned list for bullying and other imaginary moral crimes. Now the Victorians have another target, the salacious Christmas song, Baby It's Cold Outside. It turns out some of the lyrics in that tune are naughty, and you should not be allowed to hear them. The Liberal Sherpa joins us later to explain why. But first tonight, it's been 752 days since the 2016 election. And for what seems like the 752nd day in a row, the lead story at every news outlet in this country is Russia! Yes, Russia, a remote country in Central Asia with a median life expectancy lower than that of Honduras, a place with an economy about the size of that of the state of Texas, a vodka-soaked ice-scape whose shuffling workforce can't seem to build a reliable airplane. That's Russia. But nevertheless, it's a place that somehow, against all odds, manages to dictate election outcomes on the other side of the world, using a crack team of secret agents so stealthy we still don't know their names after more than 2 years of investigating it. Russia! According to cable news, Russia is the most important country in the world. Today's installment of the Russia saga has something to do with Michael Cohen and a potential real estate deal in Moscow. Now, the deal never actually happened, not that it would have made any difference had it happened. Foreign investment is still legal, even in Russia, but whatever. This is a huge, huge deal, the hugest deal. It changes everything forever. Watch.
This president may not serve out his term, that Bob Mueller may have enough that there is both intense legal and intense political jeopardy for the president of the United States.
You know, today's the first day I actually thought Donald Trump might not finish his term in office.
Really?
I mean, I think this thing is enormous.
Today is a good day for Donald Trump to resign. I really believe that.
This thing is enormous. He's resigning. So once again, the administration is doomed because of Russia. We'll see. What's remarkable, though, is that for the past couple of years, as the geniuses on cable television have been sounding the relentless alarm about our mortal foe, Vladimir Putin, an actual threat to America has been rising in the East. If you're looking for a country to fret about, forget about Russia. The Russians may pose a threat to Montenegro and Ukraine, but Phoenix and Buffalo remain safe. The real danger to this country is China, and everybody in power knows that. The FBI director, Christopher Wray, describes China as by far the biggest espionage threat we face. Federal officials estimate there are thousands of Chinese nationals in America right now acting as spies, working to steal sensitive U.S. technologies. Some of these work for the Chinese military, which, by the way, is growing at a much faster rate than our military, or for that matter, Russia's. Meanwhile, China is literally poisoning the American population. Synthetic opioids are the main driver of the drug epidemic that has killed more than 70,000 Americans in just the last year. China is the biggest source of these drugs. The Chinese government has done virtually nothing to stop the flow of them. Why would they? This is war, and they're winning. Now, you might think our media would have noticed all of this and maybe written a story or two about it, but no. Many of them, it turns out, are on the Chinese payroll, too. Vox.com recently published a nauseatingly sycophantic piece written by a reporter who had just traveled to China, it turns out, on the Chinese government's dime. Over at Jeff Bezos' Washington Post, you'll periodically see an entire insert called China Watch. It looks like a news section. It reads like the rest of the paper. In fact, it's literally a product of Chinese state media. They paid to place it, just as they pay to influence numerous think tanks around Washington, as well as many colleges and universities throughout the country. It's a huge propaganda push that is almost never noted by anybody. And it costs a lot. But over time, it's worth it. The Chinese get what they pay for. A compliant American establishment that uses fake threats, manufactured threats from Russia, to obscure real and imminent threats from China. Turns out there really are traitors in Washington, but they're not working for the Kremlin. Julian Epstein is a former chief counsel for Democrats on the House Judiciary Committee, and he joins us tonight. So, Julian, you and I both live in Washington, and we know personally a lot of people who are in effect on the Chinese payroll. Madeleine Albright has made a lot of money from China. John Boehner, the former Republican speaker, works for a firm that lobbies for China. Jim Wolfensohn ran the World Bank, advises the Chinese sovereign wealth fund, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How many people do you know who are openly working for Russia in Washington?
I think your basic point that the Chinese are a greater long-term threat to us than Russia is, I think that's true. I think in the 1970s, China had about 1% of the flows of world trade. They now have about 25%.
Right, exactly.
They were about 2% of the global economy. Within the decade, they will be equal to the size of the U.S. economy. By 2050, they will be twice the size of the U.S. economy. I think we thought when we brought them into the World Trade Organization in 2001 that it would help them play fair, and I think what we've seen since then is that they've cheated. They've stolen intellectual property. Up until 2014, they were certainly manipulating the currency. I don't think they play by the rules, and I think one of the things I agree with the president on is to get tough with China. I would approach it differently than he does, but I think he's right to get tough on China. I think the media ought to focus more on it. It's not as sensational, so it's not going to get good ratings on cable television, but it's a real problem. The disappearing middle class and working class is a real problem. It's not sensational. It's not going to be a sugar high for cable television. So I don't think you're going to have any of the networks, not this network, not CNN, not MSNBC, any of them focusing on those issues because you just don't get the sugar high from that. That's not to say Russia isn't a threat. I mean, Russia has done lots of things. All of our intelligence agencies and Republican and Democratic administrations have agreed that even though they're 1% of the world economy, they still do lots of things that are directly oppositional to us and that are trying to destabilize our interests, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in the Balkans, whether it's in the UK. It doesn't mean that they're not a real threat and there's not something to take seriously, but I think your basic point is correct, which is that we are sleeping while Rome burns with respect to China, and we have not taken seriously the fact that they don't play by the rules. We have...
Wait, so I'm waiting to jump in with a hostile question, but you're making my case for me. You've taken all of my questions and reformatted them into statements because I think you're absolutely right. So
I agree with the meta-thesis.
Okay, because I think
meta-thesis.
It's hard to... And thank you for being honest about that. And by the way, it's not a partisan thing. There are a ton of Republicans working on behalf of China, I'm embarrassed to say.
And Democrats are finally waking up. I think that there is a real threat that China does not play by the rules and that it's something to take very seriously. Again, I would approach it differently than the president, but I think he's right to say this is a real problem.
But there's all this moral outrage about Russia and Saudi Arabia, neither of which I've ever been in favor of, by the way. I'm not carrying water for either one. But the idea that a country we're allied with assassinates one of its political opponents, yeah, it's bad. But, I mean, that is a practically daily occurrence in China, and no one says anything about it. And I just wonder, should we treat the people in Washington who have a lot of power, who are getting rich from China, should we treat them as traitors in the same way that we treat anyone who deals with Russia as a traitor?
Look, I think your point about even-handedness is well taken. I think the Chinese do horrible things to journalists and to dissidents, and they get a pass on it. I think in a lot of cases, the social media giants, Facebook and Google, enable a lot of the bad behavior that's going on in a lot of autocratic regimes. We don't hear that much about it, although that's starting to get covered. I think if your point is proportionality, does the news, and particularly cable news, does it cover these things in the proper proportionality? I agree with that meta point that you're making. It doesn't mean to say that when the Saudis go and kill an American journalist, we shouldn't be getting tough on the Saudis. It doesn't mean to say if the Russians create a military intelligence attack on the United States, that that's not something we shouldn't take seriously, and we should get to the bottom of that. But I think your basic point is that, you know, there is selective outrage, there is a lot of chest thumping, there's a lot of kind of, you know, morally superior indignation that occurs on the Russia issue. And, you know, you and I may have slightly different views on it.
I'm trying to argue with you, Julian Epstein, but it's proving absolutely impossible. You did a better job than I could have in making that case.
But, you know, there's a lot of self-righteousness on certain issues. And I think there's reason to be upset about what happened with Russia. There's reason to be upset with Saudi Arabia. But I think if you're going to be outraged on those issues, your point is correct that you should be equally outraged on the abuses that are occurring in China. And the accuses in China are very, very serious. And you're exactly right about that.
Julian Epstein, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Good to see you, Tucker. Okay.
Gordon Chang has been thinking about these questions for a very long time. He's the author of The Coming Collapse of China, and he joins us. So, Gordon, thanks very much for coming on. Put this into perspective, if you would. To what extent do you think the Chinese government influences American policy?
Oh, certainly across the board. We saw during this midterm elections, the Chinese tried to influence outcomes. And they did it with not only that famous Des Moines Register's 4-page insert, but they also summoned the heads of Wall Street firms to Beijing for that September 16th meeting. You go on and on about the types of things that they've been doing.
Let me pause there for our viewers who don't know what you're referring to. September 16th, they, as you put it, summoned the heads of Wall Street firms to Beijing to do what?
To talk about the midterm elections, to talk about tariffs, to talk about the trade relationship, because Beijing was very, very concerned about what the Trump administration is doing to impose costs on China, because it is causing problems in the Chinese economy, which is under stress. So they said, look, we're holding this meeting. We want you there. And a lot of people from Wall Street actually took the flight to Beijing.
American citizens. Summoned by the Communist Chinese government actually went.
And they actually went and they held that meeting. And, you know, this shows the power of Beijing, and it shows that they were trying to change the results in the election. Now, I don't think that it would had any real effect. And the reason is, as Julian and you have talked about, across the American political spectrum right now, people are starting to understand the fundamental nature of the challenge that China poses to us. And it's certainly a much greater challenge than Russia, because Russia couldn't challenge the U.S. if it weren't for being backstopped by the Chinese.
Right. So, I mean, you got to think of Russia as sort of a drunk troublemaker that can kind of, you know, make some prank calls. But in the end, China's economy is about to become, as Julian just noted correctly, larger than ours. So, like, why aren't we completely freaked out about our future?
Well, we should be, because the Chinese are taking hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. intellectual property each year by theft or by forced transfer. And that is the lifeblood of our economy, because we have an innovation-based economy. And if we can't commercialize our technology, we don't have an economy. We end up just selling agricultural products to the world and maybe scrap metal. The point is, though, we need to have the technological giants that will dominate the future of the world's economy. They should be American. And China, by means which are certainly not fair, is trying to do that. And one other thing, Tucker, you mentioned fentanyl and opioid crisis. You know, the Chinese government runs a police state. They know about these Chinese gangs that are selling fentanyl into the U.S. And so those gangs couldn't operate unless they had Beijing's approval. Now, officials in China are making money from it. And in other cases, the Chinese officials are just standing back. But they purposely want to see Americans die. And we can't forget that.
Tens of thousands of Americans do die every year because of synthetic opioids manufactured in China. And yet I can't remember the last time I heard someone in our political class say that out loud. Why?
Oh, I think that it's because there's a lot of reasons. Part of it is because a lot of people are actually getting money from China. A number of reasons for other people is that they sort of believe that we should be engaging the Chinese. You know, this is the Nixon policy of trying to work with Beijing so that it's not on the outside of the international system. You know, that sounds nice, but it hasn't worked over 4 decades. We've tried all sorts of things, and it hasn't worked. We've tried negotiation, engagement. We've done all those things, and unfortunately, the Chinese behavior in the economy and in other things has just gotten worse.
Gordon Chang, thank you very much for that.
Thanks, Tucker.
Great to see you. Well, employees of Google just got caught once again plotting to suppress political views they don't like. We have details on that after the break. More evidence that the sinister tech monopoly Google is not on the level, not at all what it claims to be. New leaked communications from inside that company show that Google employees discussed suppressing conservative news websites in their search engine right after the 2016 election. In one post from November 9th, 2016, a Google engineer called Scott Beyer called the Daily Caller and Breitbart opinion blogs, quote, and said that Google employees should reduce the visibility of both sites in search results compared to, quote, legitimate news organizations. Other employees said it was the company's job to provide more, quote, context to rebut news outlets they dislike. Robert Epstein is a senior research psychologist at the American Institute for Behavioral Research and Technology and one of the people who's paid closest attention to the power that Google has. Mr. Epstein, thanks very much for coming on tonight. So Google has said repeatedly that it does not manipulate search results, and yet this is not the first, not even close to the first, piece of evidence we have from within the company showing Google employees discussing ways to manipulate search results. Can we be confident they're not doing it?
Not at all. you know, Google was extremely good at keeping its secrets for almost 20 years, but in the last few months that has changed, and there have been quite a number of leaks, and we have seen a number of internal discussions there, like the one that you just described. And there's simply no question that they have very strong political leanings. 95% of donations there go to Democrats. I myself am not a conservative. I actually, I kind of lean toward Google's political views, but it's frightening to me because of what I study day by day. It's frightening to me that this company, with very strong political leanings, has the power to shift millions of votes, to shift opinions on a massive scale without people knowing that they're doing it and without being accountable to the public.
How can you have a democracy under those circumstances where one privately held company has the power to manipulate people's behavior without people knowing it?
Well, that's what I'm saying, and that's exactly what's happening here. And the situation gets even worse when these huge tech companies, the two largest being Google and Facebook, when they both have the same political leanings. So, you know, in that kind of scenario, we're talking about the ability to shift in the midterm elections. I calculated upwards of 12 million votes with no one having any idea that they're doing this. This is not like fake ads which you can see.
Right.
This is invisible manipulation. I mean, I literally have to invent new names for the techniques they're using because they've never existed before.
So Google assures us that they're not doing this because they're good people, much better people than we are, for example. How can we know if they're telling the truth, and should we believe them?
Oh, well, they're sure they're good people. That's part of the problem. They have a kind of utopian thinking within the company, not just among the employees, but, you know, their top executives think like utopians. So believe me, they believe that they are doing good for humanity, good for the United States, by imposing their values, their thinking on the rest of us. The problem is, as I say, that they can do it in ways that have never existed before in human history.
So I know that, as you already said, you and I have different political views, probably don't vote for the same people. So you're maybe the person to ask. How can the United States Congress sit back with evidence that democracy, the core idea of democracy, is being challenged by this company and not do anything about it?
Well, the Democrats aren't going to do anything because these companies help them, obviously. The Republicans don't like regulation, so we have a tough problem here in the U.S. Now, the Europeans, on the other hand, you know, they see these companies as American, and so they've been much tougher on them. And I think we're going to see some pretty drastic actions taken against these companies by the EU in the next few years. And that could change their ability to operate worldwide.
I never thought I'd be waiting for France and Germany to come to our rescue, but that's where we are, unfortunately. Right, Mr. Epstein, thank you very much. It was great, as always.
Thanks, Tucker.
Harmeet Dillon is an attorney who has frequently, at cost to herself, stood up to big tech, and she joins us tonight. Harmeet, thank you very much for
Thanks,
coming
Tucker.
on tonight. So this, again, as I just said to Mr. Epstein, yet another example of evidence from within this company, and there are other examples like it from Facebook, that show that they're not on the level, that they're lying to us, and that they could undermine the very basis of our democracy. Let me ask you the same question. Why is Congress standing by in the face of this evidence and doing nothing?
Let me add to that. Why is the Department of Justice not opening up antitrust investigations?
Well, exactly.
Why is the Federal Trade Commission not investigating them for their deceptive trade practices and failure to disclose their manipulation of data and theft of data from Americans and others? So today itself, the European Union opened up its fourth in the last 2 years investigation into Google for antitrust issues for manipulating search. Guess what? And so far, they've been fined $7.1 billion in Europe in the last 17 months, but Zippo here in the United States on the same issues. And one of the reasons, Tucker, is that these companies, both of them, are very adept at spreading money around Capitol Hill, including through the use of a former Republican Congresswoman, Susan Molinari. And those are their lobbyists, and they're very effective. That's why you see legislators backing off for the most part. But We are talking about fascistic, control of our data in a way that is perceived as benevolent certainly by liberals, and is not being criticized at all by the right. I think it's a very dangerous situation.
So, but what's the point? I mean, just as a macro question, what's the point of having a government, of sending half your income every year to Washington, if they won't protect you from the most basic and obvious threat to our entire system, which is these companies? Like, why do we have a government if they won't stand up to Google and Facebook?
Well, interestingly, I think we're going to see some action on the part of these companies, against these companies, I should say, in the new Congress, because liberals are concerned about the data theft, much more so than conservatives are. But we're still not going to see anything about this bias in terms of viewpoint. In addition to what you've covered on your segment tonight so far, obviously there's suppression of YouTube videos on an ideological basis. Google also discourages its advertisers from advertising on conservative platforms like Breitbart and others. Google's search engine has labeled the California Republican Party as having Nazi ideology and Republican women as being enablers. It is the most despicable, defamatory work, and it is all protected by the Communications Decency Act, which members of Congress certainly could edit and change, but they don't. And so I'm very disappointed in our government, our conservative government, frankly, in Washington on its failure to act on these issues.
So as you just pointed out very quickly, these companies operate in the way that they do very profitably because they have a special exemption from the Congress, which could revoke that exemption because they're not platforms, they're media companies. Of course, they're editing. Name just, if you would, since we're live now, 3 or 4 members of Congress who, might lead the charge against this.
Well, I guess I don't think any members of Congress currently have identified themselves as being hostile to this. But, Jim Jordan certainly seems to be somebody who's familiar with these issues. Matt Gaetz is another. I think these guys are sensitive to these issues. And I don't think they're beholden to big tech. Maybe they haven't been there long enough to have that sink in yet. But we have had senators. Mike Lee, for example, has looked at the antitrust situation and then backed off. I'd like to see our Senate, newly constituted with more votes, take a hard look at this, have some hearings, really put them on the spot.
Yeah.
Sundar Pichai is going to be testifying in Congress next week. I have suggested that definitely some hard questions need to be asked, and I know that there's an intention to ask some hard questions
I hope
next
that
week,
happens.
so we'll see what happens.
Hope they get moving. Harmeet Dillon, you've been brave on this question. We're grateful for it. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Well, a man who says he was trying to blow the whistle on the Uranium One deal, remember that? Says the FBI repaid him by raiding his house. The story's after the break. Well, here's an interesting story you may not have seen. FBI agents raided the home of a Uranium One whistleblower. That's according to a new report by the Daily Caller News Foundation. A man called Dennis Nathan Kane has turned over documents to the DOJ as well as to the both House and Senate Intel committees. The documents allegedly show that federal officials failed to investigate possible criminal activity involving the Clinton Foundation and the Uranium One deal. Now, Kane says the FBI repaid him by sending 16 agents to raid his house for 6 hours. Dan Bongino is a former Secret Service agent, NRA TV contributor, and author of Spygate, the attempted sabotage of Donald J. Trump. He joins us tonight. Dan, thanks a lot for coming on. So this is one of those stories I personally don't want to believe could be true, that we live in a country where the FBI is used to carry out political grudges. How do you assess this?
Well, Tucker, I don't want to believe that either. Having been a former federal agent myself, this is deeply disturbing. But there's a bifurcated way to look at this right now, and I'll just sum it up like this: this is either really, really bad for the Clintons or really, really bad for the FBI. Meaning this. You don't typically raid a whistleblower's house. The whole idea of being a whistleblower is you're providing information voluntarily to assist law enforcement or the government. Why you would raid the house is puzzling to a lot of people. Some people believe that this could be really bad for the Clintons and be kind of a tying up of the Clinton Foundation case that appears to be being investigated by John Huber right now, the United States attorney.
Yes.
On the other hand, Tucker, listen, the people involved in this Uranium One case, the Rosatom and the 10X case, are all people who are knee-deep in the Spygate saga. That's just a fact. That's not a conspiracy theory. It's just true. Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, was the prosecuting United States attorney on the precursor case to Uranium One, that disaster. Bob Mueller was the FBI director. So forgive me for not being willing to give everybody a pass on a suspicious raid, on a whistleblower's pass, as just a matter of fact. I guess I should say it this way. I'm not taking anybody at their word anymore, and neither should you either. We should ask questions on this.
What's so surprising is who's not asking questions about this. So for generations, the left elevated the idea of whistleblowing to a sanctified place. Whistleblowers were protected. They are protected in law, and they're protected because liberals wanted them protected. And yet I haven't heard anybody on the left complain about the FBI raid on this guy's house. Why is that?
Tucker, listen, the rage at Donald Trump has destroyed. You have brought this up on your show so many times, it can't be highlighted enough. The left, which previously aligned with groups like the American Civil Liberties Union, that was actually interested at one point, no more apparently, in defending civil liberties, has completely abandoned that now. They have now flipped the script entirely to actually defending weaponized government. It is unbelievable, the transformation we've seen. Listen, it's not in dispute that there are serious abnormalities in the way the Donald Trump investigation was conducted, the Trump team investigation, and the way the Clinton investigation and the Uranium One investigations were sidelined. But nobody's even remotely curious on the left about this. It's really incredible because, Tucker, as you know with government, someday it turns on you too. Government doesn't respect party. It's all about power.
It's unwise, very unwise. Dan Bongino, thank you, as always. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, Tucker. You too.
Well, as you well know, dozens of U.S. cities have decided they're not going to enforce federal immigration law because they don't feel like it, and that's okay with the left. Now, one police chief is looking to apply the very same standard to gun control laws. How much support is he going to get? He joins us next. Oh, Merry Christmas from General Motors. The car company just announced plans to lay off 15,000 workers and shut down major factories in the states of Michigan, Maryland, and Ohio. Now, the cuts are coming despite the fact that General Motors has posted nearly $3 billion in profit just last quarter. Workers at one soon-to-be-closed plant told the Wall Street Journal that they were, quote, blindsided by the decision. They didn't know it was coming. One person who will not be struggling to pay for Christmas presents this year is General Motors CEO Mary Barra. She made nearly $22 million in the last year. That makes her the industry's highest paid CEO. Toyota's CEO, by stark comparison, makes less than $4 million a year, even though he runs a far more successful company. Now, what has Mary Barra done to earn all that money? Well, as CEO, she's laid off thousands of workers. She shut down plants and overseen the recall of tens of millions of defective vehicles. A few years ago, she was forced to testify to Congress about faulty ignition switches that killed more than 100 drivers. In modern corporate America, that is considered a deeply successful record. Give that woman a raise. Of course, as GM is serious about cutting costs, there is one obvious solution: fire Mary Barra. Well, for years, liberal cities and states have been claiming the right to ignore federal immigration law. Now, one small-town police chief in Washington state is saying the same principle can be applied to far-reaching gun laws. A new gun control ordinance in Washington imposes stricter background checks, raises the age for buying a semi-automatic rifle, and allows gun owners to be criminally prosecuted if their firearms are stolen and then used illegally. Lauren Culp is the police chief of Republic Washington and says that he wants his town to be a sanctuary from these new gun laws. Some local residents oppose the new measure in Washington. Watch.
Opponents say it forces gun owners to secure them in a way that could put them in danger.
I'm concerned at not being able to access my gun when I need it.
You're not going to tell the criminal, can you hold on a moment, because we have a law that I have to, safely store it in the garage somewhere and so can you hold on a moment? I'm going to go take it and I'm going to defend myself. Then we'll talk.
You call the police or things go down, it's less than 1 minute. So those seconds count.
Police Chief Lauren Culp joins us tonight by Skype. Chief, thanks very much for coming on. It's good to see you.
Good evening, Tucker. Thanks for having me.
So is this, in effect, a sanctuary, your town, Republic Washington, from the gun laws of your state?
I have suggested an ordinance and recommended it to the city council, and they are in the process of reviewing that and doing their due diligence to see if they want to pass that. But as far as the police department goes, we will not be enforcing that.
So cities that have decided to ignore federal immigration law have received the applause and support of almost everyone on the American left. What do you think the response will be if your town passes this ordinance?
I don't think the same people would be very happy. But the thing about it is illegal immigrants aren't covered by the Bill of Rights in the Constitution, and gun owners are.
A very good point. So what will happen next, do you think? Will the governor of the state try and force you to enforce the law that you think is unconstitutional?
Well, I don't know how he could, Tucker, because we live in a constitutional republic, contrary to what a lot of people tell us, that we live in a democracy. But we have the rule of law in this state and across the United States, and the Constitution is the law of the land. And everybody knows what the Second Amendment says. A lot of your viewers might not know what the Washington State Constitution says about firearms. But really quickly, it says the right of the individual citizen to bear arms in defense of himself or the state shall not be impaired. So that's even more explicit than the Second Amendment. So I don't know how they can get around that and try to force me to go against my oath of office to uphold that.
Interesting. I had no idea your state's constitution said that. It sounds like it's being already ignored throughout the state of Washington. So very quickly, this state law would require gun owners to keep their guns locked up at all times?
It requires you to keep it locked up because if someone gains access to your gun, say you're away from home and someone breaks into your home and steals your gun, goes out and commits a crime with it, you can be charged up to a felony for that person getting your gun and committing a crime with it.
If
Absolutely ridiculous.
If someone steals
like
your car,
charging someone who has their car stolen and the person drives off and goes through a crowd of people. It's ridiculous.
Well, that is ridiculous, and good for you for fighting back against it. Chief Culp, thank you very much for coming on and explaining that.
Tucker, I have a real quick message for you, though.
Yes.
Ted and Shemaine Nugent told me to tell you hi.
Always a welcome message, especially on a Friday. Thank you. Thank you, Chief. Good to see you.
Good night. Thank you.
Well, there's no war on Christmas. That's like some right-wing trope that only dumb people believe. Meanwhile, the war on Christmas continues apace. Yesterday it was Rudolph. Today it's something else, and we'll tell you what it is. Stay tuned.